Welcome, everybody, to the Analytical Innovation Podcast presented by Analytical AI. I am Dr. William Monroe, the VP for Data Science at Analytical AI, and I have the pleasure of hosting this podcast with all the great folks that we have to talk to and the great things that we have to talk about. Today, you will notice I'm not alone, and it's also not just only physically present in one location. Today, I've got Mark Froelich, the CEO of Analytical AI, with me. We're in the same room, just on different cameras here. And then I also have Admiral Roughead on the call as well. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark so that he can give a more in-depth introduction of Admiral Roughead.
Thank you, William. Today we have the pleasure of a fantastic guest on our podcast. He is a classic overachiever. Admiral Gary Roughead retired as the 29th Chief of Naval Operations, and prior to that, he commanded both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets, has received way too many awards to mention, and he restructured the Navy to be on the cutting edge of cybersecurity. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, is a trustee of Johns Hopkins University, and serves on the board of managers at the Johns Hopkins University of Applied Physics. He is and has been on multiple corporate boards, currently serving on the Maersk Line Limited Board, Northrop Grumman, Dodge and Cox, and others. Admiral Roughead, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Well, Mark, it's really a pleasure to be with you and to meet William as well.
Thank you. So, we talk about innovation a lot on our podcasts, and you have a passion in that area and a passion for keeping the country safe. And having been in command of the Navy and on the cutting edge of cybersecurity, where do you see the state of innovation in national defense?
Yeah. Actually, I would see the state of it as behind where it needs to be and behind where it could be. I've been involved in what I would call national security innovation for a long time. And when I talk about national security innovation, there's the military dimension, there's the intelligence dimension, foreign policy, and an area that you're very familiar with, homeland security. Obviously, most of my time has been on the military dimension, but I think over time there have been some significant changes to which we're trying to adapt, but in my view, we're not doing it very well. And I can get into a little more depth if you'd like me to do that.
Please, please.
Yeah, militaries have always been at the front end of innovation. It's from the beginning of time. Militaries have devised new ways of projecting power, of visiting violence on others. It goes all the way back to the longbow in jolly old England. I can imagine the first person that had a longbow arrow shot at them probably said, "Where the heck did that come from?" And we've seen it, particularly in my area, naval innovation, submarines, aircraft carriers. And oftentimes there's innovation takes place, and then there's a reaction to that innovation. I think that one of the things that has happened is wars have always accelerated that. We're seeing it play out in Ukraine today. And I think that regardless of how enamored we may get with innovation, wars tend to still be brutal. And I think there was a time when we thought technology would result in these immaculate wars and everything would be fine and they'd be fought in cyberspace. And sadly and tragically, we're seeing war in its most brutal form in Ukraine. I think the biggest changes, however, that I've seen over time is that U.S. national security innovation used to come out of our public sector. That was the government investing in various programs, advancing technology. There was collaboration and cooperation in our national laboratory network. I think universities were much more involved in national security innovation, but that landscape has changed. Um, as far as the public dimension of, or the public sector dimension of innovation, we have not rationalized what that infrastructure would be, what the human capital would be, as innovation has moved more to the private sector. Companies like yours and others are really at the front edge of innovation. And within the government, we have not been able to make those changes, largely because some of the infrastructure enjoys very solid political support. So if you want to try and reorganize, restructure, maybe close some down or move certain technologies to another lab, you run into immense political resistance to that. I would say the other thing that I've observed over time, particularly in the Department of Defense, is that we have really become much more process driven as opposed to outcome driven. We have a culture now where we've created a lot of overhead. And so we spend a lot of time working on process. And the other thing I think that has happened is that our process, our structure is such that we do not incentivize enabling people to spend money, spend resources on things that are of high risk. We want to make sure that we eliminate the risk. We go in very cautiously. If there's failure, we tend to stop the process and do a great deal of analysis, and then we will move on again. The other thing that has happened within the Department of Defense, and I would argue maybe within government more broadly, is we no longer vest total authority in one person. Now that sounds kind of maybe a bit draconian, but when I look back over some of the more consequential developments in military technology, they have one thing in common, whether it's the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb, whether it's the nuclear power revolution that the Navy experienced and the creation of the nuclear submarine, or in an area that I was intimately involved with during a good part of my career, integrated air and missile defense. The one thing those three successful transformational initiatives had in common was that one person was responsible for the technology, responsible for the human capital behind fielding that technology, and responsible for the money. And they were able to fuse all of that together to create truly transformational outcomes. So we've become more risk averse. We've become very process oriented. We tend also to not leave leadership in place on significant programs long enough for essential milestones to be achieved. Our assignment of human capital has become one where we are prioritizing career progression and promotion that's normally based on longevity and also on having particular experiences. And we tend to move that programmatic leadership around before key milestones are achieved. So invariably, when you have someone new that comes into the picture, taking over a program, they tend to want to analyze and test and reset and move off perhaps in different directions, which in some cases can be very advantageous. But at the same time, you've lost accountability for achieving key milestones on the path to a particular outcome. I think that as the transformational technology wave has come about, there's been a proliferation, at least within the DoD, maybe within the Department of Homeland Security, excuse me, of new organizations, new structures, new commands, new offices that are responsible for innovation. Um, and, um, and the output of those organizations has been limited at best. They tend not to have the resources, the money behind them, and the flexibility to deploy those resources in ways that are effective. I think DARPA may be an exception to that. But for the rest of the ones that I see springing up, the structures are quite Byzantine. The process is king. Um, Activity is um, viewed as success as opposed to outcomes. There has become the term that I often use. A lot of these organizations move around and take part in what I call techno tourism, attending conferences and going out to site visits and then coming back and talking about what all the great technology is going to produce for the military. But technology and innovation, as I've said, is interesting, but unless you have an application, it's really inconsequential. And so I see a lot of
So,
activity, but not output.
there's definitely risk in something new.
Hmm.
But from, I wonder if you have a similar thought as I, which is doing what you've been doing for too long has a lot of threat and risk to it.
Right. And not only does it have a lot of risk to it, it also builds in a lot of inertia. And from that inertia, you develop a culture that is tends to be more risk averse. Nothing new. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, comes from Machiavelli when he said, "Nothing is more difficult to take in hand than to change the nature of things," and that has been the case. And so the I have examples of where culture has been the inhibitor. When I look at innovation and the application of technology, I often say there are three things to it. One, there is the technology itself. Can you develop the technology? The second element is, do you have the policy and the resources to advance it? And then the third is, how willing will the culture be to accept it? And you can go back in history and see how new technology has failed to take hold. Sadly, wars tend to break some of that culture down when you begin to realize that there are better ways of doing things. But culture is, I think, the hardest thing to overcome. And a case that was near and dear to me was during my time leading the Navy. I was very much interested in developing autonomous aircraft and autonomous undersea systems. Um, we were able to fly an autonomous airplane on and off an aircraft carrier, refuel it autonomously in 2012. We're just now getting back into that game. That is over a decade of lost time. Um, and I would argue that culture was a great inhibitor because the nature of a piloted Air Force, in which case the Navy has its own Air Force, um, a pilotless airplane is a threat to a piloted Air Force. Um, and and so I think that trying to break that culture down is important. The other thing that I referred earlier in my comments about the process and the structures that we have in place. During my time, we were working on a very exciting, to me, it was very exciting, system of underwater unmanned vehicles. Um,
Hmm.
and I and I was very clear about it at the time. My main objective was to keep that initiative from becoming a program of record. Because if I did that, I would have to transfer the program to a program manager who
Mm.
was not the brains behind the system that we were playing with. It would then fit into this process and sequence and series of milestones when we wanted to move faster, when sometimes things didn't work, but we wanted to go back in the water again. Had we put it into that more formal structure, I think we would have lost that flexibility. So, on one hand, it was a cultural inhibitor. On the other, it was a organizational, a structural, and I could even argue a cultural inhibitor there because the culture was we need to take these initiatives through a very set process. There's a fantastic piece of technology being applied today, and again, it is from a company with which I have an affiliation, but this isn't about that particular technology. It's developed under DARPA auspices. Um, and the question now is, what do we do with it? I would say in an aggressive, innovative culture, what you would say is, hey, this thing is pretty good. Let's go ahead and build three or four more of them and play around with them and see what more we can do. Instead, the decision will be, does this now become a program with all of its structure, with all of its overhead, with all of its procedural constraints, and or do we just go out and try some things? Sadly, when I put my scorecard on innovation today, I follow China pretty closely. I have for a long time, and I've watched the People's Liberation Army, and in my case, as they call it, the People's Liberation Army Navy, progress extraordinarily quickly. And I often say that China now is what we used to be, with the Chinese being much more risk tolerant. They are putting their money on the applications, whereas we are focusing on the technology. I think China is moving quicker to applications and applying that technology on a variety of different platforms. Obviously, the Chinese civil military fusion concept, where they can mandate technology moving back and forth between the public and private sector in ways that we don't do, because of the nature of our government and society. That obviously has been very helpful for them. But again, I come down to the fact that they are focused on applications. You could argue they stole a lot of technology from us, which they did. But the fact of the matter is now they're becoming legitimately innovative, because I think of this faster cycle of accepting more risk, fielding, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, and then creating that cycle over and over again. So, I think that we are um, not moving as quickly as we can, not moving as quickly as we should, not moving as quickly as we must if we want to have a superior application of technology, particularly over China and Russia and even some of these proxy groups that Iran has operating in the Middle East.
It's um, it's very concerning that the Chinese are moving at the pace that they are, and when they stop copying us and start to innovate on their own, it seems that we're definitely too slow. Otherwise, they would just keep copying us. It'd be a lot easier to do. And go back. We go back to that old saying, right, which is change before you have to. And do you think that there's anything that can be done so that the process can be changed in order to accelerate innovation and stop being sort of the blockage that seems to be ever present?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that at least within the DoD, and it sounds like I'm just banging on the executive branch of the government. This is more than just the executive branch. This is Congress because of the oversight
Right.
and the tendency over time that when there has been a problem or a shortcoming, that they overlay more oversight requirements and milestones and what have you. And I'm not for a moment saying just give the military or the intelligence community a blank check and let them just go off and we'll never, monitor what they do. But I do think particularly given the shift from the load of R&D really becoming more dominant in the private sector, we need to rationalize the DoD, Department of Defense R&D infrastructure and human capital. I think we also need to heavily engage in some personnel reform to get to the constraint that I see of um, worrying less about the perfect career path and more on individuals who can deliver on milestones and outcomes. And so we have to get in and make sure that we incentivize that as opposed to the personnel system that we have now. I think there should be more flexible funding, but I will say with appropriate oversight, to create funding lines where the services, whether it's the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps, can use funds to do what I would call small experimental buys. In other words, don't mandate that if something is going to go forward, it has to go forward with a full-blown program of record. What we should be able to do, and I highlighted this manta ray issue, there should be within the department the ability for money to be expended on a small purchase, an experimental protocol, an operational fielding of the capability to see how it really performs out there. I think if we were to do that, that would be helpful. One of the hopes I had, particularly when we were talking about the autonomous airplane on and off the aircraft carrier, um, I would like to say in days past, we would have gone out and maybe bought 2 squadrons of those and say, okay, let's go out and fly them. And some of them would probably crash and some wouldn't work well. And I honestly believe we would be farther ahead if we did that than waiting for the more structured programs to come to place. So those are just some of the things that I think could be done. Uh, Really, rationalization of the R&D enterprise in concert with the realities of what's happening in the private sector, personnel reform, funding flexibility with oversight, with the provisions to make it very easy to do small expenditures of funds for more rapid, more realistic deployment of the application of the technology, and not just loving the technology because it's a cool thing to have.
And do you see that there's inherent risk to an individual making a decision regarding spending government funding on a technology if it ends up and it doesn't work?
I think we have become overly uh, focused on that, and in our effort and their well-meaning efforts to deploy successful technology, that we are slowing the process down, that we are actually possibly incurring even more cost, and retarding the the sequential infusion of improvements over time. Uh, it just takes far, far too long to move things out. And then when you overlay on top of that the fact that you don't have anyone accountable for realization of certain milestones, it's just not a good mix. And I would argue that when you look at on the commercial side, the significant technological advances that have been made, um, I think you would find that what I'm talking about that needs to be done in the DoD is exactly what happens in the private sector, and it's it's more than that. I mean, I was quite taken when I saw one of Elon Musk's boosters come down and get captured by the chopsticks, um, on the tower. Um, that there was a time, I would say, when our government was moving at that same pace, and frankly, we did it to ourselves by putting too much structure into it. And I think we've got to get back to um, that more exploratory mindset. Um, we have to increase our risk tolerance. We have to be ready to send things out to be used, uh, mindful that we don't want to kill a bunch of people and fielding prototypes. But I think you can do both, and we really need to become more committed to doing that.
Admiral Roughead, thank you so much for your thoughts today. They're very insightful, very interesting, and then also very alarming. And so gives us a lot of reasons to pause and think, and how do we change these issues that are getting in the way and move forward. So thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
I look forward to it as well, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Roughead, for being on the podcast today. It's been really great, as Mark said, to hear your ideas and hear how in the startup world we call it a minimum viable product, how you could potentially take that mindset and put it in the government space for innovation and encouraging those rapid innovations. So it's been really interesting to hear your insights about where you feel like those things could go. I'm also going to just go ahead and encourage anybody listening to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast and to hear future interviews. I'm sure we'll have Admiral Roughead back at some point in the future. So once again, thank you, Admiral Roughead, and thank you, Mark, for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, William.
Thank you.